just briefly, some rules of engagement. I'm rushing through this a bit because I haven't calculated time for myself. Or as I said, I'm trying not to spend too much time on organizational stuff. We have 10 to 12 minutes. If we get close to the end of the time we have, I will hold up the sign with 2 minutes and then with 1 minute, and then I will try to interrupt you. And we will move directly into the plenary discussion because we don't have a discussant form. Okay? Okay, and if I will say that again when we get started with the discussion. If you have questions, please say your name first so that we know who you are. Okay, that's it from me. And I would propose we go in the order of the program. Do you agree? So, Damaris, go ahead. There is, I think we need to put this, switch this, put this back.
That's just additional.
It's additional, so it is. Oh, okay. Okay.
I'll get on with it.
You leave me alone here, huh?
You to share your screen so the Zimmermann can also see your screen.
Here. Here's screen.
It's here.
Getting better just after 3 years. Die Leute, die da waren, bevor es früh war.
Okay, perfect. Happy to be here. The first presentation, the first panel. My paper's in German, my notes are in German, my presentation is in English. I just switched to English, so I'm sure it will be perfect English. So, my name is Damaris Braun, you already heard it, and I'm doing my PhD at PRIF, generally on threat perception and cohesion in Europe. So this project is not part of my PhD, but it's also connected to threat perception. And what I thought with you for the next 12 minutes is just, I'm going to present you in the beginning my key argument. So whoever read the paper, it's under Fazit, that comes first. Then you get the background, my research design, and of course my results and conclusion. Okay, so what's my key argument? What I think could be true. I expect there's historical trauma in Ukraine. And I expect that this historical trauma is active right now and that there are certain trigger effects, meaning that less harmful aspects for Western allies are actually reinforced by past history. So that people living in Ukraine have stronger reaction to certain stimulus, which we would maybe consider as neutral or less harmful, and therefore they show a stronger reaction than what we might expect. They seem irrational, sometimes they're unconscious, and of course they influence threat perception. So that's the main idea. How do I get there? You already know from different research that transgenerational trauma transmission has been proven. It's epigenetic, it's in the family, it's in a social cultural background. And when I talk about historical trauma, I mean a collective trauma in the past, which is still active today and influences current generations, even though past generations have gone through the original traumatic situation. So why am I here and not somewhere in clinical psychology or somewhere else? Because there's a strong political dimension in this. Trauma, especially collective trauma, influences perceptions, political dynamics, it impacts attitudes, cognition, and trust. And we know, like I brought you two studies from China, and also one from Ukraine, that this was one from Shenyang, is also from the Great Chinese Famine, where it impacted attitudes and beliefs in the political domain, not just concerning food, but on a broad perspective. And it also can be used strategically by regimes later on to kind of play with the trauma effects. So what I focus on in Ukraine is the so-called Holodomor, and it's an article famine. Probably most of you know about it. It happened about 90 years ago. It still has long-term negative consequences. It cut the debt of about 4 million Ukrainians at one. And what I wanted to look at is, are those historic incidents like the Holodomor still relevant today? Are they made relevant by the participants I study? How are they addressed? What are maybe possible implications? And are there any trigger effects of those historical traumas which influence threat perception in the current conflict? What I did was an explorative study. In German, I would call it klein aber fein. Big method. You see, it was fast. It was in June and beginning of July this year. It's a small sample, but I conducted 2 group discussions and interviews, and also a survey on threat perception, observed stress, and there were different rating questions on the Likert scala. So, of course, there are limitations. Like, this is too small to be representative. It's more of an explorative character. So, what are my results? What I did is, on the left side are my points, and then I always brought you some quotations from the different groups or interviews. Okay. So what I found was there are historical traumas made relevant by the participants. And I only brought you the ones which were made relevant by both groups and also the interviewed persons. And the Holodomor stands out. Like, what do I mean by this? It's mentioned more often, more intensive. People showed strong emotions when they were talking about it. And participants mentioned different consequences, also in the field what I already presented. What was new is the theme helplessness and the theme repetition. What do I mean by this? They kind of saw the actual war in a row of different happenings. Like, for them, that's something, it's again a trauma caused by Russian regime. So, and why do I mention this? Because it's so, like, chronic trauma and repeated trauma is way more harmful than one traumatic situation. So that's something you have to be cautious about. And I hope you have the time to read the quotes. If not, they're all in the paper in German. So second thing, you see a short thing from the survey. I asked them about, like, how do we perceive different types of threats? And so, like, violence, shootings, threat of hunger. And what I found interesting is threat of hunger is rated as high as the threat of physical violence. So, and it's also really close to bombing and shooting. And so I was really surprised by this because there was no real hunger condition, right, on a broad level in Ukraine. So my idea is there seems to be an overestimation of threat in the field of hunger, probably because there's still influence by the Holodomor experience, which is transported from generation to generation in Ukraine. And the experts I talked with, they described an overestimation of this threat, and at the same time, they overestimated it themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's always interesting to have this double thing. In the survey, there was reported that Holodomor-afflicted families, like those who were part of Holodomor in the past, react differently to stressors in the current conflict. And then this is a quote from an interview that she says, "Why don't we capitulate now? Then comes famine." So that's a realistic fear in some people's heads. Okay, and then final slide for the results part. And what I also found is that there is hope mentioned, and that they discuss a lot about national and collective identity, even though I didn't ask about it at all. They're fighting for their own narrative. And what I found really interesting is there's a change in language. So when they were talking about the past, it was more helpless, we couldn't do anything. And then now it's like we have scope for action. We can win, we can change something. So there's hope of support and justice. And in the paper you have long about the Nuremberg trial that they expect to have something like this in now in their current history. The question we are kind of trying to answer in those 2 days is like, how should we respond? And I want to give some hints from the background I just presented. You see again my arguments, and what my main point is we need to be aware of it, right? So in the opening talk, we're just talking about our Western ways of knowledge and need deep local knowledge. So this is part of local knowledge. We were talking about Ukraine needs agency as an own nation. It needs its own narrative. It needs awareness of its partner and support from its partner, also with this keeping in mind. And then this means basically a trauma-sensitive approach, which is not limited to clinical psychology, saying like when you have a disorder, you go and see someone. It's really an issue, a collective issue. You need to stabilize a society, giving social, psychosocial support, also cross-border. And what I brought for you finally are some principles from Hoppe and colleagues, which are quite well used in the field of trauma mass interventions. And it's sense of safety, which of course is difficult right now. But we also can provide a sense of safety if our communication is reliable, if what we say and promise is going to come, like giving a different sense of security, of safety than physical one. Also calming, collective efficacy, like how to support really this country to fight themselves and not be like Entwicklungshilfe or something like this. And then the most important one, what we know from research, is social connectedness, social support. When you go through crisis and you lack social support, that's the biggest risk factor that we're not going to handle the crisis well. And on the other side, if the crisis is taken, we have social support that helps us best. And that can give us hope. Hope also can include values, faith, or values like they're fighting for European values. So this is all an aspect of that. Okay, so thank you for your attention. See, I was running.
Okay, thanks so much. Next on our list is Sebastian Hoppe.
Yeah, so I face the same challenge. My notes are in German, my slides are in English, but right? Let me just. So this is
Yeah.
okay.
So I don't understand either.
Okay.
Mach das mal größer, das oben. Nee, das oben, das kleine, genau, das machst du mal groß gerade. Und dann machst du unten auf Screen Share und dann musst du die Präsentation raus. Einmal Tech Support, einmal Tech Support.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great, thank you. And thank Damaris. I think this was already one dimension or aspect of history, which we got to know now. And however, my interest is not with history as an analogy, and my interest is not with the use or abuse of history by Russian, Chinese, or Ukrainian actors. Rather, what I want to do, I want to use and hopefully not abuse history and historicity myself. And as you can see, the paper as such is not about the Ukrainian war. So I have at least one witness here in the room, Kai, who can confirm that the paper was already written in a previous version, and it was actually presented the day the war broke out. So there's kind of a legacy here. Of course, I've updated it now. It's called Sovereigntist Non-Development, Historicising the Sino-Russian Conjuncture. And this is, a discussion paper made of a very big, large 40 pages paper, which I've linked in the discussion paper. So I would be happy to receive comments on the larger paper or on the discussion paper. So where I'm coming from here, actually the paper it binds together two interests of mine. So one is related to my own PhD project, which I will speak about for 1 minute. And then there's another thing completely unrelated to my PhD, which is an interest in historical sociology and how can we make historical sociology a fruitful approach in the analysis of foreign policy, or in the what I would call the reconstruction of foreign policy. So just briefly, my PhD project, which I hope to finish next year. It is how it is, right? The politics of regional development, state patronalism, and political economy in the Russian Far East over the past 15 years, where I reconstruct all kinds of patron-client relations in the Russian Far East that are relevant for infrastructure and economic projects. And just to give you some haptic impressions of what I'm dealing with here. So we had this APEC summit, you might have heard of that, right? It was held in Vladivostok in 2012, and before the summit and after the summit, there were all kinds of infrastructural projects, economic projects in the region. And the decision in 2007 to hold the summit in 2012 is my entry into the whole story of how Russia has dealt with this region. So we're speaking here about these regions bordering China, North Korea, and Japan via sea, of course. All kinds of things were realized and not realized there. So it was actually an empty island, Ruski Island, before it became more crowded and the new campus was built. That's also the place where the summit happened, and where you could do nice field work before the war, actually. So I was made it here when I did my field trips to the region. New bridges, you might have heard of that. That's the reason why they used to call it the New San Francisco, which is not, of course, but maybe there are some parallels, I don't know. However, doing research in the region, you come across, of course, you come across China and the hopes that were projected onto China when it comes to Russian development. And just to give you this one quote here, by Vladimir Putin, I'm convinced that the growth of the Chinese economy is by no means a threat, but a challenge, carrying with it the enormous potential for business cooperation, a chance to catch the Chinese wind in the sails of our economy. I just love that quote. And of course, this Chinese wind has not materialized in the region, at least not to the degree that the Russian state wanted it to materialize. So this is the empirical side of the story. I kind of morphed into that side project, Russian-Chinese relations, via my PhD project. The other interest is an interest in historical sociology, which I'm interested in for years now. And the short story is that starting my PhD years ago, I've come across this forgotten lineage in German IR, which was back then called Historische Sozialwissenschaft, internationale Beziehung. And so a historical social science of IR. And these scholars, they try to connect historical analysis, a critical perspective on class and legitimacy relations with an analysis of larger questions of international politics. And there's a Marxist strand, there's a Weberian strand, there is still some place for that in German IR, for example, Klaus Schlichter and colleagues. And I just saw that there's actually a common thread, and you can sum up this thread with the historicity of international politics. So the notion of historicity is really what aligns all these approaches. So I wrote this piece, which was thankfully published in ZIP last year, which binds together all these lineages and makes the argument that actually we should try to make this a fruitful thing for foreign policy analysis. So the paper now is an attempt to fill these conceptual considerations with an empirical story, for me for the first time, if you want. And yeah, I'm eager to find out whether I've succeeded or not. Just briefly, why again a historical sociology of international politics? Right? Maybe it failed in the 80s. Why reviving it? A sparring partner for me was Benno Teschke, with whom I've been in contact and kind of trying to pin down what we mean by international or historical sociology of international politics. So what we want to do, we don't want to have a structuralist understanding of international politics, right? Where we have liberal ideas, or we have realist great power politics, pushing politics to some outcomes, right? On the other hand, we don't want to have a diplomatic history or a theory of practice where we're looking at the micro-theoretical foundations of international politics. We kind of want to have both worlds, the best of both worlds, and we think that the notion of historicity is actually helpful in reconstructing these interactions happening there. So what we think is important is to privilege the explanation of specific outcomes, while the method we propose can be transported to different historical contexts. So why outcomes, you might ask? Well, outcomes can be a lot, right? It can be multilateral peace treaties. So this is the realm of Benno's work, 1648, 70, 18, whatnot. I'm a bit more contemporary here. Wars, bilateral relations, regional orders or world orders even. So outcomes can be actually a lot of things. And here you see one sentence that maybe pins down the difference to other approaches. So the historical sociologists opting for the above methodological instead of theoretical commitments always analyze it from the perspective of agency by using history itself as a framing device. So this is kind of the historical turn here. So I propose in the paper to capture this agency with the term of strategic projects, right? This is not that fancy, actually. There are strategic projects all around the place, and both liberals and realists analyze them. However, analyzing them in their historical formation and how they then transformed, I think, is unique to a historical sociological approach. So here are some terms that are important for us in terms of methodology. This is the vertical and horizontal dimensions elites find themselves in, right? It's not just an encounter with the outer world, it's also an encounter with contenders domestically, with class contention, but also with more in a Weberian sense, with legitimacy relations. Of course, conflict is everywhere, process, transformative events, and context. So how does this translate to my empirical story here? So I think in order to understand the power and the scare also of this Sino-Russian relationship that has emerged since the early 2000s, we need to trace both projects to their formative periods at the beginning or in the late 2000s, beginning of 2010s. If we do that, we can see that there is this formative period. It's a period from approximately 2008 to 2012, or in the case of China and Xi, to 2013. And then we see that at the core of these two projects in Russia and in China are two very different developmental trajectories. So I don't want to throw around all these names, but I need terms to pin it down, right? So I call it non-transformative conservatism in late Putinism and transformative developmentalism in early Shiism. And I'm very glad it was not my invention, Shiism, but I found it, but it looks nice, so I will use it, right? But you see that there's a commitment on the Chinese side still, despite all authoritarian regressions, to a developmental goal, and I'm happy to discuss that. So I have a pretty optimist take here on the Chinese trajectory, and there is a very non-transformative, in another paper I call it regressive tendency in the Putinist project, right? And these projects, they were not a given, they are internally contested and externally defensive. And to pin down what this defensive stance is, I looked into all kinds of speeches by Putin, by Xi, some programmatic texts that were published, and I identified one thread that unites them, and this thread I call sovereigntism. So it's not sovereignty as such as a term, it's sovereigntism as a political project, right, that is made. So one step, reconstructing this formative period. In another step, then I trace the process, how this conjuncture was made from 2012-13 to our current era. And I don't have time. I just want to say, I think the defensive elements of sovereigntism, what binds them together, was heavily challenged by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So as a historical sociologist, I don't want to do predictions, but if I would have to predict, I would say the war might constitute a caesura also in Sino-Russian relations, which we don't see now, but which we might see. So to be controversial and to throw in some discussion points, neither liberal nor realist policy approaches are well placed to capture these nuances, convergence in divergence, and the sources of the Sino-Russian conduct. And as a result, policy and diplomatic prescriptions lack the necessary precision to navigate the new global disorder. So this is, of course, over the top and controversial, but I'm happy to receive the comment on that. Sorry for taking my time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. On to you, Hubert.
All right. As you can see, I changed my tables before. Anyway, so in my stuff is not a kind of research project, but more like a kind of essay or think piece prompted by an observation or by the observation of the debate over the last 6 months or so, and prompted also partly by my own efforts at historicizing this conflict. Also, that you will forgive me that in this presentation, I couldn't resist the temptation to put my own like pop cultural analogies on my work on analogies. I mostly made that for Daniel Lambert, but he's not here, so but hopefully you can see it sometime. Anyway, so what I want to do is first talk briefly about the use of historical analogies, then their functions, and finally their intentions. what I think might be my core argument about the performative nature of historical analogies in the Ukraine war debate and beyond. Now, it's never been easier to find empirical material for research. I mean, historical analogies are really all over the place, so really it took taking a lot of time to find nice example. Political actors like Putin with his harking back to the Great Patriotic War, but also Zelensky, we've heard a lot more, and other historical remembrances. The media, of course, is full with it. The social media is full with it. Our daily conversations, take all kinds of different analogies to try to describe and make sense of what's going on. Some analogies are okay, some are a bit outlandish. For example, our retired colleague Christian Hakel likened Western efforts to stop Russia to Napoleon's failed 1812 attempt to conquer Moscow. Also, I had recently a piece by Wolfgang Streeck, who likened opposition who likened the support for the Ukrainian war effort and the treatment of the people who supported to the silencing under the Nazi regime. So a little bit over the top, I would say. But anyway, there's all kind of metaphors going around, and it seems that the supposed failures of our theories to account for what happened, failures that will certainly be taken up in many other panels of this conference, so I don't want to go more into detail in that has inspired the recourse to historical analogies as a supporting evidence. One might even say, our theories can be seen in a way also as historical analogies expressed in the more innocent language of political science, concepts which are not so normatively charged as most analogies are, and which do not directly call for specific actions, at least as long as you're not called John Mearsheimer or so, but balance of power, interdependence, post-colonialism, that all has this historical background. It has this implicit understanding of being comparable to an earlier period. So what are the functions of historical analogies? These are the ones that are most, at least from a first view, are most often practiced in humanistic crisis, Munich, World War I, colonialism, and so on. What are the functions of these analogies? And they really have all kinds of different functions that make them so useful and so powerful. I think these functions are already partly well researched in the literature. And in my quite random survey of Ukraine metaphors, I found all these four functions. The first, of course, is the one that you would think is the one most adapted to research. Use them as empirical and theoretical add-ons to illustrate and supplement historical and theoretical explanations. So as a kind of, use them for historical comparison. Of course, this has a lot of traps that have been laid out in work by historians in much detail. So to read all that, you have to clarify the scope conditions very carefully. I haven't read Tim's paper afterwards to see if he does it right. But we will soon see. So the second function, and that makes it already, that is already a thing that makes them so difficult and touchy, is that they also have an implicit call for action in it, and that's always the case with the Ukraine war historical analogies. They clearly indicate right or wrong. We know how the story ended. Did it end well? Then, okay, let's move in this direction. Did it end wrong? We have to be very careful. So the fascism analogy employed by historians such as Timothy Snyder, but it can be found also, for example, in Michael Zürn's piece and so on. The message is clear. We have to resist dictators. We have to, not appease them and so on. So there is a historical explanation there, but there is also a call for action. Implicit, sometimes explicit. The same function is true for the famous Munich analogy, appeasement and so on, or World War II, or even if you say, okay, we're talking about a genocide in Ukraine. It's clear this is an attempt to describe what is happening, but there's also a call for action. That's quite obviously. There's the Cuban Missile analogy that goes usually in a contrary direction. It's a warning about escalation. I myself did that once in a piece of mine. Early on in the Ukraine, it's a call for the need to talk and negotiate. Paul has it done in a piece. The same is true for the World War I analogy. Now, I don't know if Tim uses it in this way, but there's a call for being cautious, not exaggerate. For some, call for negotiations. For some, however, the Cuban Missile analogy, and that shows that these analogies are also ambiguous. It shows the importance and the function of deterrence. So it can also go in a different direction. And that is, for example, also when people talk about colonialism, link that with the Ukraine war. For some, it's and lots of countries in the world do that. It's condemning Western aggressiveness and the expansion of NATO and so on. For others, it describes Soviet imperialism, which is compared to colonialism beforehand. So this is the second function, and of course that this function is always there if you are usually there if you use historical analogies. The third function is very closely related to that. That's legitimizing political decisions that are already taken. So politicians love to do that. But I want to talk a bit more about the last function, that is what I call awkwardly reinforcers of identities, because I find that most interesting from a political point of view, that there's a performative and social function. Call it the winter is coming, we have to huddle together. But the question is, who are we and who is the other? And analogies are very useful to actually describe that. So in that sense, they also constitute or reinforce certain discourse coalitions. So my argument is that the use of historical analogies helps to identify these specific discourse coalitions that are underpinned by different notions of who we are, or to put it crudely, are the Ukrainians and their allies part of us or not? And I think it is this identity dimension which puts so much vitriol into the debate, but makes it also very intractable. I found that the different camps that you can identify are very similar to debates on military intervention. Frank knows all about that. In Germany, very similar to the debate, for example, in the Kosovo War. So you can distinguish a support Ukraine camp and negotiate with Russia camp, which one can be called cosmopolitan. So it's like the we is a larger group that goes beyond borders. So and a more communitarian group that where the we is seen mostly as our group within our borders. And in between these groups, awkwardly called the right-left dimension, divides them. So if you look at the support of Crane Camp, you have the we is the old Western alliance, defensive realist group, where Germany is part of an alliance of Western democracies, and as we fight against Russia, the Cold War analogy is the preferred one in this group. We have to resist here. And on the more left side, there are the liberal institutionalist humanitarian group that takes the we much broader, includes the Ukrainians in this group, talks about suppression all over the place, fights against fascism, genocide, and so on. And then there's the other group, the humanitarian group, that talks maybe about our German interests. All right, almost finished. So on the extreme side, there are the ethnic nationalists like Gauland, this is not our war, or the offensive realists saying this is not in our national interest. World War I might be an example, but might be also awkwardly chosen. And there are the so-called national pacifists, Wagenknecht, for example. So talking about disadvantaged groups in our society, and we should not work together with the Americans or their proxies in Ukraine, but rather care about the disadvantage in our own society. Yeah, here colonialism, colonialistic crisis are preferred analogies. Here, so this might be pretty cool, but it reflects very much the debate on military intervention, where I just finished a book about, and that's how I came up with that thing. I think to conclude my talk, if we are aware of this performative character of historical analogies, it also allows us to better understand the whole debate on the Ukraine war and our own positions and presumptions, and also with regard to our theoretical stances. So it might be a useful thing to just ponder on that as we go on with this conference and listen to the different stances and probably also historical analogies that are going to be presented. Thank you.
Also, great illustration game.
Demonstration effect. Very sorry.
I have a second one.
Seht ihr das da?
Check nochmal raus.
Seht ihr die Präsentation am Notebook?
Ja, ja, die ist da.
Dann quillt er sich da runter, oder? Dann quillt der Beamer sich da runter.
Das kann sein.
So.
Willkommen zu der Wissenschaft, Politik, Standort bei der CD Hamburg. Hallo, wir haben eine grüne Pizza. Das ist hier Windenergie. Pizza.
PDF als Love-Result, und ihr relativ schnell beim Weg zum Film das PDF speichern konnte.
Das geht um den Beamer tatsächlich.
Achso, okay.
Der sich jetzt aufgenommen hat.
Oh, cool.
Have you tried switching it on or not? Hoppe, das erst für Jeff. Thema ist durch. Wir hatten recht, und dann nicht. Lass mal trinken.
Sonst hilft nicht einfach nicht. Stecker ziehen, einfach da oben auf den Tisch steigen, einmal Stecker ziehen. Nee?
Ich meine, ich habe ja eben außen nochmal, als er nicht wollte, außen angemacht. Und das war okay. Das war echt gut. Ich versuche mal einen Portal wieder zusammen.
Okay.
Aber leider hat er zwischendurch geht das Ding ausgeschaltet. Das sagt er das.
Maybe we should all log into Zoom.
Genau, der Beamer ist runtergefahren. Das soll das die sich jetzt abkühlen, bevor wieder.
Man darf es nicht anfassen.
Nee, weil das passiert bei uns im Zyklus wieder.
Weil niemand überrascht.
Ja, wir können gerne. You will start taking some questions on the others.
Yeah.
So, ja.
It's not only extremely use of time.
Ja.
I'm sorry, so the beamer isn't working. Yeah. So it doesn't. Changing the technology here wouldn't make a difference. And we can come closer and look at the screen.
Well, actually, we had a suggestion, maybe like we can all log on Zoom and just like watch it on the screen.
Oh yeah, that's a
So the Zoom link is on page 3 of the printed program. They found an electrode.
I mean, and the technical challenge switches from the beamer to the router here.
Oh, well, don't be so pessimistic. Not yet.
Just don't turn on your microphone when it's done because.
Oh, yeah. Don't do that.
Okay, so I will try. I will proceed to find it.
Good thing we don't have a discussant. Sexy.
You see, it's like I said, you know, something's bound to happen.
Well, at least one thing,
I don't know about you, but I'm doing an update.
of course you do.
Of course. So, yeah. And everybody logged in? Am I the only one doing an update? Is it working? Is it working?
Ich muss erstmal einen Link finden.
It's right underneath the title for our panel. Yeah, underneath each panel's title, there's a separate link for that session.
Okay.
Everybody is awake in the loop.
So let me know once you're in.
It's only a matter of hours.
Installing updates. Do not close this window.
Oh, my participant numbers creeping up. So some I hope those of you in this room who are not also in this room can hear me now that I have changed the technical arrangement slightly. If somebody who's in the Zoom can give a thumbs up or some other indication if you can hear me, that would be fantastic.
Yes, we can.
All right.
The midterms are back.
Okay, everybody in?
All right.
Can we get started? Okay.
So thanks so much. I will try to somehow climb out of that box into which Hubert has just put me, and hopefully will do so in a way that doesn't make me fall into all the other pits that he laid out for us. So I've been struck over the past 8.5 months by the wealth of parallels between the situation that we find ourselves in and 1914. In logic, in rhetoric, in images. Let me just give you a few illustrations thereof. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia all marched into World War I with tremendous enthusiasm, thinking that this would be a short affair, of course, a war that would end gloriously for one's own side, but it would above all be quick, so no need to plan any further. And accordingly, on they marched. If you look at the way in which this looked at the end of February of 2022, of course, the technology had changed, but the parallels I thought were striking. The willingness of the Ukrainians to use any means available, including civilian public infrastructure, to get themselves to the front lines to defend their own country, I thought striking parallels to what we saw in 1914 when the French, well, a few thousand of the French army took Paris taxis to get to the Marne, even if the decisiveness of that move was probably a bit overstated. The parallels in images of the trench warfare of 1914 and 2022, with another example of also strikingly parallel images between the two conflicts, some of which, of course, are images that we know all too well from movies such as Invest Meets Noise in this case. Now, discussions about how technological changes bring about changes in the offense-defense balance might be another illustration thereof, even though this particular image, the image that you see on your screen, is actually slightly doctored, but the underlying rationale is nonetheless correct. You know, that boat cost Russia about $750 million. The two missiles that brought it to the ground cost Ukraine 300,000 each. Clearly a situation where the defense seems to have the upper hand, and as we've learned from World War I, when that is the case, you can have extended stalemates, and notwithstanding recent Ukrainian advances, I think optimism about this war ending anytime soon are probably quite exaggerated. Now, of course, we also see here, as we did in World War I, that technologies that seem to be usable initially just in one particular way can only a few weeks later potentially be used in quite a different way, and thereby shift the balance in a different direction. So predictability is difficult. But one of the maybe most striking parallels here is the impression that many came away with in February of 2022, similar to the summer of 1914, that hopes that had been associated with interdependence as a means to peace had been ill-founded and had not been borne out, that those investments in some sense were all down the drain. Of course, the core claim of the sort of interdependence approach, more specifically and theoretically articulated in political science over the past 40, 50 years or so, but the general ideas, of course, have been around already pre-1914 as well, is that interdependence decreases the likelihood of militarized escalation of conflicts of interest and increases the likelihood of peaceful conflict resolution by making conflict escalation more costly for all sides. As was alluded to in the introductory remarks today, that's informed, of course, German Ostpolitik beginning at least in 1969 and 70, and was widely seen only rather 2 years ago as having contributed very positively to the end of the Cold War. But it seemed to have failed in 2022. It certainly was seen to have failed in 1914, even though German industry and finance had developed interdependencies, not just within the alliance structure that Imperial Germany had built up, but very much also across the lines of the major alliances at the time. So it raises, of course, the main question of why, and any complex conflict is going to make answering that question difficult. The interdependence claim, or interdependence providing a means to peace, has always been just a probabilistic claim. And if political leaders see greater benefits in actually using military force to pursue their aims, then the losses due to the destruction of the benefits of interdependence might simply be sufficient. But more importantly, I think it had seemed, I think, to many observers that basically interdependence just wasn't even creating a meaningful incentive to maintain the peace. And I think there's both proponents of the interdependence approach, at least as a theoretical idea within political science, maybe as a legacy of having come out of essentially very realist way of thinking. And the critics, both more recent and over the years, often have, not all of them, but often have quite a blind spot for domestic politics and particularly domestic institutions, which means that we're paying too little attention really to mechanisms through which interdependence might or might not lead to peace. And a key issue here would seem to be that the beneficiaries of interdependence actually need to have some role in the political process, need to have some leverage over political decision makers. Otherwise, why would we possibly expect it? So that's in a full nutshell the idea underlying this. I look at this empirically by examining the coverage of the crisis of July 1914 through the early days of ultimately August 1914 in the Frankfurter Zeitung, the sort of predecessor, if you want, to the Frankfurter Allgemeine, founded in 1856. It was considered a very good newspaper at the time that was very widely read. In the years leading up to World War I, it was one of the 3 largest papers in Germany by circulation. It was at that point, this is basically pre-radio days, but this is the main means of mass communication. So they were publishing 4 editions a day, 7 days a week, 3 morning editions, and then 1 evening edition. It was considered the primary news source for Germany's financial and commercial elite, especially in Frankfurt, but far beyond that. economically conservative, but politically quite liberal, with a substantial network of correspondents and subscribers, reflecting that very internationally interdependent structure of the German economy at the time. So if you look at the front page, it has subscription prices from almost all over the world, certainly all over Europe and some of the Americas. Now, I look at this in three phases. The first from June 29th, when the assassination of the Archduke is first reported, through July 3rd, when the funeral rites are completed. Then July 4th through 22nd, when coverage of the event actually sort of recedes quite a bit. The focus then is, but only occasionally, on the sort of larger, longer term consequences. And then July 23 through July 31st. July 23 is, or really the evening of 22, is when the first news comes out that there's a delivery of the Austrian note making demands of the Serbians that would be essentially a capitulation of Serbia politically. First comes out, and July 31st is when press censorship is on account of the impending war reestablished in Germany. So in that first period, there's a lot of reports of expressions of sympathy and condolences for the royal family. That is actually the bulk of the coverage at the time, not really particularly interesting for our purposes. They look at the assassin, have lots of stories about his personal and political background and the networks in which he moved, and the portrayal of all of that as rather misguided forms of nationalism. There are elements of sort of prejudice against Southern Slavs in particular, but there also is quite a bit of criticism actually in the paper in those early days of the way in which the Austro-Hungarians have been essentially sort of sparking this crisis by being very provocative. There's a suggestion that Russia may have sort of fostered some of this by the way in which they have supported certain factions within Serbia. It also gets reported that in the Russian press and in the Russian government, Germany is being blamed for this by having given assurances to Austria that may have made them sort of more aggressive in their behavior. So there's a sense in there, so between the lines, that some larger conflicts are sort of brewing underneath of this. But there's little that goes beyond that. In particular, so political implications and the risk of conflict escalation is only very rarely discussed. And there is a lot of emphasis put on the sort of need to calm it down. When there are discussions of this, the risk of war is in this early period only once really mentioned, and immediately followed by warnings against it being lunacy to actually allow this to escalate. Some of the concerns about the alliance dynamics that we know only too well from the security studies literature are also very much prominently in there. I'll skip that discussion. Then we have a couple of weeks when relatively little news really happens in this regard. Occasionally, issues come up, and so the calls for peaceful resolution are relatively frequent in there. And in particular, current concerns raised that people might sort of politically use this conflict for other ends, and there's a call made clearly for sort of resisting such attempts. Then when things heat back up after July 20th, give me a couple of minutes to finish this up, then there are increasing calls for sort of calming this down. Then when things really escalate after July 23rd, we see very stern warnings repeatedly, often explicitly linking the economic consequences of the crisis to the need to calm it down and avoid an escalation into a conflict that could engulf most of Europe. The Austrian position in particular is rejected, and calls for Germany, the imperial leadership of Germany, to resist. It's sort of putting its cards all in with the Austrians. there are warnings about and it's in opposition to escalation. Again, repeatedly sort of linking this to economic interests of Germany. Although there's also some hand-wringing about the implications for German alliances that, as security studies scholars would certainly expect. But the sort of underlying current is again and again, which is particularly well captured in this quote: no national prestige is important enough to outweigh the terrible consequences of such a war. And on the specific issue of interdependence, this is explicitly recognized and articulated, and it's used again and again to make arguments against the war. In particular, they recognize perfectly clearly that if, in fact, Russia and Germany would enter this conflict and France and would have actually a European war, that this would not be a short affair, that this would be a complete illusion. By the time the war actually starts, July 31st, they collapse in the opposition very quickly. They also didn't have much of a choice because press censorship was imposed on that day. Just a couple of quick conclusions here. I think the expectations that we have about the consequences of economic interdependence would need to be linked more explicitly to domestic political institutions. The beneficiaries of interdependence, that is, those most likely to suffer losses from the escalation of a militarized conflict, then if they have no political leverage, and if they're not proactive, then we're unlikely to have any peaceful effects. Now, I did take the risk in the subtitle to this talk to offer you a word about the prospects for peace, so let me do that in half a minute at the end. Sorry. At some point, every war must end, as Ihre told us some years ago. At that point, one of the things we're all going to have to chew on terribly, I think, is the incredibly fast transformation of this relationship between Russia and Ukraine, from a sense of brotherhood to a sense of arch enemies, very much in similar sort of rhetoric and with similar suffering underpinning it, as the relationship between France and Germany after 1870. And as we know only too well from the Franco-German relationships, it is possible to overcome this. But it takes decades and it takes tremendous effort. And interdependence can help in that, but only if it's accompanied by the right sort of political measures, some of which we might be able to help with from the outside, providing security guarantees, by providing open markets. But in doing so, we also better be careful again to not reestablish the kind of dependency that we have put ourselves into, without denying Russia some avenue for actually re-entering the world economy on terms that is probably among the strongest incentives that they have to somehow settle the conflict at some point. Thank you so much.
Despite the obstacle, I would propose that the panelists move gratitude chairs to the front, because otherwise the Zoom participants will look into nothingness.
It's a very existentialistic.
I see Nicole Deichhoff first.
It is not much time, so
Yeah. So go ahead, please. We'll
Okay.
try to multitask.
yeah. Yeah, first of all, thank you for four really thought-provoking pieces and presentations. I really love listening to you. I have, I think, now two concrete questions to two papers. The last paper by Tim and Hubert's paper, actually. To the last paper, I'm not sure, after listening to you, what I should really learn from your analysis. So while you were going through your data, I thought, well, this is an argument that interdependence can only contribute to peace if we are dealing with democracies, or at least liberal states in a way, so that commercial interests do have a chance to take influence on foreign and security policy. But listening to your conclusions, I'm not sure whether this is the main lesson that I should take from it. But if it would be, then I would like to ask you whether there is not also an alternative, a strand to interdependent theories, and that is not about, let's say, like societal interest taking influence on foreign security policy and decision-making, but also on states who are voluntarily binding themselves to another state, and by that increase the costs
before going to war. So that it does not have much to do with societal interests taking influence, but it has to do rather with really state interests that perceive of it as being too expensive to interrupt this relationship. Hubert's paper, and I love it because I'm struggling with these kind of historical analogies that we are seeing in the debate. But again, I was asking myself, what should I learn? So what do I take from your analysis? In what way should I use historical analogies, or shouldn't I use them at all? Or is there a certain function that I should shy away of and then discipline myself, and I can also judge others in using them? So this would be my second very concrete question. Thank you.
Okay, given the time, I would propose that we directly collect in the first round, and then so that everybody kind of gets to ask questions. You go ahead, and then we'll maybe to collect 3 or 4, and then make a quick round.
All right. 3 points for the first 3 presentations.
Sorry, could you say your name? Is
From my stage in Hamburg. So I have 3 points for the first 3 presentations. The first is there's a kind of question to understand better what kind of people you ask. So what the people you surveyed, where do they come from, where do they live? I would be very interested in getting an understanding of who people are. To Sebastian's presentation, you mentioned you have this term sovereigntist, like that is right, and you define this right as shielding from external contenders. One of the aspects of that for China and Russia, and after now 2022, Russia is changing track from that initial position. Do you see any parallels from your description to the reactions of the Western world, put it this way, after February 2022, in a way that we're also moving into this kind of sovereigntism paradigm you described? And the last point is about the metaphors and analogies. Is to say, you presented several functions, right, of these analogies, and I was wondering, all these functions you described were in a way instrumental, right? So they were like adding something to something, prescribe something, legitimize, reinforce, always with the goal in mind. So you had this analogy, you would use it for a particular purpose. And listening to this, I was wondering whether we should pay more attention to the sphere or the way where the debate takes place, because in the title you mentioned IR debates, you presented up but on public debates, like in Germany, right? And I would add a third, and maybe that's a connection to Damaris' presentation, there might be a very personal use of analogies, which is not instrumental, but has to do with personal identities and, well, the lives we live, right? So just ideas I had when I was listening to your presentation. Maybe it's you, or maybe it's not.
Okay, Cornelia, you're next, and after that I'll make a cut, and Kai, after the first round, we'll get back to you.
Okay, one logistical question. Shall I unmute myself so that the Zoom participants could also hear my question?
Sorry, again?
Shall I unmute myself? So that
You can try, I hope nothing bad technically will happen. No?
For your approval. Okay.
I can hear myself, I think.
Okay, so I'll unmute myself then. Yeah, well, my question is.
Can you speak up a bit, maybe?
Yes, I will try. I have 2 questions, one for Damaris. So I like very much your concept of trauma, and also how you try to take stock of it by conducting interviews and focus groups and having this comparison to the past. And I was wondering, how do you unpack your concept of trauma in relation to memory? Because also you mentioned it, I think, on one slide, but I mean, thinking of memory as remembering of the past, as a permanent commitment of the past. And there's a lot of literature there on Ars Memoria from Maurice Alvax, Jan and Alida Asman. So basically, memory is not something that is, it was not a static notion, it's a very dynamic notion, which makes it very interesting because in this dynamic, in the jetzt form of memory, the past is never quite explicit in the way it is remembered in the present. So I was thinking, how does this mnemonical condition is affected in the active form? Because if I understand correctly, you made a point that Ukraine is partly a reactivation of this mnemonical condition of the Holodomor the situation. So yeah, how you see this referentiality and this mnemonical condition changing? And my second point is to Sebastian. You put forward a very interesting concept on sovereigntism, and I was wondering in relation to which notion of sovereignty you build your conceptual framework, because I can think of so many notions of sovereignty, of legal sovereignty, political sovereignty, constitutive power, constitutive power, which are all of those are internal forms of sovereignty, and then we also have external sovereignty. So yeah, how do you define your notion of sovereignty that underpins your concept of sovereignty? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please feel free to pick and choose in your responses, and maybe start with Sebastian and then go down the line, and then in second or the other way.
Okay, yeah, very briefly. I think although sovereignty is in the title, it's underexplored in my paper. Then actually on sovereigntism, there's just a very small debate. It actually comes from French discussions. And there's this notion on sovereigntism there. And I mean, starting with Alex's question, I think, yes, I mean, if there will be a follow-up paper, I would really like to explore this. You can imagine in historical sociological terms, you can explore it as a chain of transformative events, which then spills back into the West, or it spills into the West and transforms projects there, right? Inspired by what is happening in what appears as the context. So this is very interesting. And the brief answer is yes, I think that all kinds of sovereignty projects have been awakened as a reaction to this war. I think the war is so transformative that it has pushed several of these ideas, and now we have, I don't know, digital sovereignty and the infrastructure sovereignty and critical infrastructure has to be shielded from authoritarian powers. All these kinds of political notions, I think it would be interesting to trace them and see at what point in time did they gain traction? Who are the actors who are pushing these claims? And which brings me to sovereignty and sovereigntism. That's right. I do not define sovereignty, but I do define sovereigntism. I mean, for me, I'm not into norms research. This is others are doing that, right? And I think sovereignty, for me, it's a norm, while sovereigntism is really a political project. So actors making a political claim that they want to shield something, the legal sphere, the economic sphere, politics, from foreign and also, by the way, domestic influence. So it's really often it's an elite project shielding certain things from foreign intrusion. But I mean, you are certainly right. I have to think about sovereignty and not only sovereigntism. Can we ask questions to our fellow panelists?
In theory, yes. In practice, I can put you on the list.
Could you put me as well, please?
Sorry, let me just briefly address Nicole's question. Thank you. Yeah, I could have articulated this a little bit more clearly, and in part I didn't do so because I'm still to some extent with what the implications are. Not because I can't come up with an idea about what the implications might be, but I'm extremely hesitant to just put as the bottom line that basically independence, might work if it's between democracies, and let's forget about that. To some extent, that is actually the conclusion that the analysis suggests, right? And I think put it slightly more softly, we, I think, should think about interdependence differently when it occurs between democratic, generally sort of liberal democratic states than under different circumstances. And your suggestion that basically the sort of the more statist version of it might also exist, that's true, right? If the government really thinks in terms of the sort of national interest writ large, then of course the economic losses that would be expected if you forcibly interrupt basically that interdependent relationship by resorting to the use of force, military force, then they would presumably be more hesitant about this. But to some extent, I think that's the version we've had, like we've been lacking, at least in the way in which, including, I think, German foreign policymakers have been thinking about independence. They have not made that distinction. I think it would be important to make. In terms of that latter version that is more regime independent, I suppose, one of the interesting observations actually that come to me by, thanks to some of the research done by a couple of PhD students at the IR chair at the Hochschule für Politik, is actually we can see in all kinds of international organizations, including things that most people don't look at and that seem to be rather marginal, maybe, like the International Electrotechnical Commission, where purely technical cooperation basically occurs on technical standard setting. So we have data from the past 20 years there, and one of the striking things that we never looked at before, but now have done, is that Russia has essentially detached. Like over the past 15, 20 years, when China has really ramped up its engagement in international bodies, when India and Brazil have to a lesser extent, but also notably increased their engagement in global governance, Russia has increasingly withdrawn. And we probably should have worried about that a lot earlier. Thanks.
Hey. Well, thank you for the two questions like that. I was hoping for them since I had to run through all my data. They're great questions. First of all, I want to respond to the question on demographics of the participants. They all differed in gender and age, different career stages. They even spoke different languages as mother tongue. Like I had some people in their mother tongue was Russian. So that was super interesting also discussing with them the challenges right now speaking Russian. And they differed in the regions they're different. So some of them even were in war regions and were taking part in the group discussions and having no lights on. And I asked them like, what's going on? Why is it dark? And I said, well, we have to turn the lights off. So that was pretty impressive in a negative way. They were all in key positions in crisis management, military, educational system. So I asked them different things. I asked them to assess the stress they observe in the people they work with, like the soldiers or in school or in crisis fields. And I also asked them about like how they perceive the threatening situations right now in that country. And so maybe you could argue and say, well, you should go on with regular citizens. And I would say for ethical reasons, that's not a good idea, because even those people who are well trained already reacted quite emotionally, at least some of them. So after the group discussions, I really had to intervene and stick with them for a while. So that would not be responsible to kind of ask people in a war situation about past trauma and how this affects and kind of bring up old family stories. And taking the word stories, I come to the second question about trauma and memory. And I would say even what we remember or how we perceive history right now in the present is already constructed, right? Like even how we present ourselves, like everybody here would have a different storytelling about the technical problem we had. So it's not just a question of time that stories change and positioning change. It's also, it's always constructed. So I would argue there's more intersubjectivity than objectivity. And then you kind of have to consider the different ways how trauma can be transmitted. And memory, I would put under family ways and also the culture. like how are narratives transported within the family and also in a society? Are there any rituals? Like, for example, over 70% of the Ukrainian population says on Holodomor Remembrance Day, they light a candle, even though the Remembrance Day has only been established like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. But then there's also the epigenetic way of transmission, where you sperm from the father and also the stress from the mother in the womb can transfer trauma reactions. It has it of mice. They also have seen this in human beings. So there's another component. It's not just how you talk about it. It's some sort of, not really in your genes, but in the way you kind of use your genes. Let's put it this way. And the positive messages that this can be changed, like even past trauma, and that would be one of my arguments. If Ukraine has an effective fight right now, this might help them to overcome all heritage, all negative stuff, and really kind of move forward and create a new identity with agency. But we need to support, and they need support in this, and reliance, and really like stability in their partners. Right? So we saw in the analogy picture, like people arguing for ceasefire and like maybe giving territories apart. And this is like really dangerous if you support one message here and another there, and then maybe you have background talks with not involving Ukraine. That's not a good support. Did this answer your question? Okay, good.
Okay, Hubert, you're up. If you can, keep it brief because we're officially out of time, and at least at the moment the doors open and the coffee crowd part is in, we're done.
Okay, very quickly to Nicole's question. So the paper was mainly to learn about debate, not learn about the use for using analogies, and that's a really difficult question. I would say there's nothing against it. Probably it's avoidable, but one has to be really careful because they provide kind of shortcut answers to certain questions without usually specifying the scope conditions, whether the comparison really works. So they are very useful to open questions, I would think, but they are not useful to close the question or to really fundamentally answer the question. So it's kind of mini theories. And the second thing one has to really careful about is this performative character. They always give these policy prescriptions. So maybe it's good when you use the analogy to think about whether you also can use a counter analogy. So as you, for example, use alternative theories, use alternative analogies. And few people are doing this. They just stick to one, but there could be other lessons from history that are opposed to that. And at least, and if you have a message, you have to make it maybe explicit and not hide it behind some kind of analogies. So that's would be my take. And for you, I was still thinking about Nicole's question, or I didn't get the first part of your questions, but that I think was mostly suggestions. That
more common question, really, yeah.
Okay, so that I can just take, and or is there a question that I should answer? And
No, not necessarily. I mean, you could just say, I don't care.
I say thanks because my usual one question I didn't get it.
Yeah, it's fine. So those are as a comment.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm really sorry, but we're out of time. My bad. Because of the technical difficulties, and I'm already seeing people gathering. So I'm not taking any further questions. Maybe you can come to the point and we can discuss informally the bits, because otherwise it might be that you just ask the questions and we don't have an opportunity to respond to it. So let me use this opportunity to thank everybody, the panelists, for really, really fascinating papers. Thanks for a great audience. And I hope we can continue these conversations over the next 1.5 days. And I think this was a great start. So thanks a lot.